Hello everyone, I'm John Dee, the Australian coordinator for RE100, the global initiative that's led by the Climate Group in partnership with CDP. I'm the head of the Do Something Foundation, which runs the operation here in Australia. I'm speaking to you today from Katoomba in the New South Wales Blue Mountains. It's the land of the Gundungurra and Darug peoples, so I'd like to start our webinar by acknowledging their elders, past and present and emerging. As this is a national webinar, we'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to our land, our sea and our community. Today is the first of a number of webinars that RE100 is going to be running in partnership with Business Renewables Centre Australia. Both of our organisations are working with businesses to bring about increased use of renewable energy within the corporate sector. Now, we're all aware from recent media coverage of the rising cost of electricity and the problems in today's energy market. But today is mainly about solutions, and that's why our Buying Power webinar is so important. Today, we'll be specifically looking at how the current electricity market is affecting corporate decisions to contract renewables. In the case of RE100, we have hundreds of companies that are contracting renewable electricity deals. Over 360 major companies have now joined RE100, and all of them are going 100% renewable with their electricity use by a set date. Between them, our members are using more than 380 terawatt hours a year of electricity. To put that in context, that's more electricity than the UK uses. So when companies are transitioning that much electricity to renewable sources, it's really important to negotiate and get the very best possible deal. And that's one of the issues that today's webinar is going to be looking at. We'll be specifically talking about the wholesale market. We'll be looking at supply side problems as well as the current opportunities for corporates when it comes to renewable energy. Before I pass you over to Chris Briggs from the BRC-A, let me introduce you to our experts on today's webinar panel. Tennant is the Head of Climate, Energy and Environment Policy at the Australian Industry Group. He's got extensive experience of climate and energy policy design, industry and energy sector dynamics, as well as advocacy and engagement on behalf of industry. Tennant has also brought together diverse industry and community stakeholders for joint action and statements on climate and energy. Lisa Zembrot is the Director of Energy Markets for Schneider Electric's Energy and Sustainability Services. She spent over 15 years forecasting global energy and carbon markets. She's managed hedging and trading programs. She's negotiated energy supply contracts, and she's advised on long-term investment decisions. She's also designed and implemented renewable energy strategies. Our final expert is Jonathan Prendergast from BRC-A. Jonathan is the Technical Director at BRC-A. He's a clean energy project and procurement advisor, and he's got 14 years experience in the development of innovative projects and contract structures. Jonathan also has specialty knowledge in corporate renewable energy procurement with a background in engineering and finance. If you have any questions that you want to ask our panel, please type them up and put them into the chat section of the Zoom app. We'll come back to those questions later in the webinar. I'll now pass you over to Chris Briggs from BRC-A. Chris is the program lead in the Energy Futures team at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS, and he's also technical director at the BRC-A. He will now start today's panel discussion. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, John. First of all, I should say I'm standing in for our program director, Jackie McEwen, who's rejoined us in the last few months, but unfortunately couldn't make it today. For those of you who don't know us, the Business Renewables Centre was set up with funding from ARENA and state governments to be a source of independent advice on off-site renewables procurement and corporate PPAs. We are a member-based organisation with over 200 members across developers, retailers, advisors, and renewable energy buyers who are our primary audience. So we have a suite of resources and guides and primers to try and help buyers navigate the process. We run training, and we run this webinar series, Buying Power, with a monthly session on a topical issue. And there's certainly no more topical issue than the state of the wholesale electricity market right now. It's permeated popular consciousness. And so we're gonna dive into that today. We've obviously seen incredibly high electricity prices over recent months, driven by coal and gas prices. We've seen the use of emergency demand response, with the market operator paying big users to turn down loads or turn on backup generators as supply reached the edge of its limits. We've seen retailers going bankrupt. We've seen obviously IEMO step in to actually suspend the market. Yesterday, the Energy Market Operator released its latest version of the Integrated System Plan, which is its blueprint really for the future of the electricity system. And in its launch, the CEO stated, quote, "Investment in low-cost renewable energy, firming resources and essential transmission remains the best strategy to deliver affordable and reliable energy, protected against international market shocks." But if that's true at the level of the energy system, what does it all mean for individual organisations thinking about buying off-site renewables? Is now a good time? What are the factors they should be considering? So that's what we're going to dive into with our panel. And I'm going to start off straight away with a question for Tennant. How do you feel the current market will influence your members' decisions to contract off-site renewables?
So I think an awful lot of business energy users are still very much in holy crap, what's happening mode. Most are still on the same contracts that they were on before the prices in the wholesale market began to rise. Some have been thrown into that market by problems with their retailers, but we will see, and a minority have spot market exposure. We're going to see more and more member businesses face these prices. And the next step is a combination of, can somebody do something about these prices? And we will see what politics and market reform delivers. But I think it is challenging actually for any policy responses to dramatically influence prices over the next few years. We can certainly do better or worse over the longer term. And what can we do for ourselves? And so looking for opportunities to save what will otherwise be a dramatically higher energy bill will be a significant priority for those businesses who are energy intensive, but also plenty of others who, like, everybody will notice if a bill doubles. And that is, I mean, in electricity, the wholesale prices are, for the futures market, are very dramatically up, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland, but also in other regions. They're everywhere. They are around double what the futures were a year ago. And in gas, it looks even worse, and probably will last for longer. So I think there's going to be a very strong and enduring driver for looking at efficiency, at better contracting, and at either contracting with offsite renewables or doing self-generation where that is practical.
Yeah, as you say, this sort of extreme market volatility of the type we're currently experiencing can induce either paralysis or panic in equal measure, depending on organisational temperaments. Taking a slightly longer view beyond the current storm, I mean, what factors do you think buyers should be thinking about if they're thinking about contracting a longer term PPA now? Like, How do we look past, I guess, the immediate maelstrom and what should they be thinking about?
Well, what's going on at the moment is a combination of many things, some of which are relatively short term. So there's been about a quarter of coal generation capacity that was unavailable at one point at the same time. Amidst a cold snap, amidst high fuel costs for gas peakers to replace that coal generation. So yes, there's been an acute crisis. But on the other side of the acute crisis lies a chronic crisis because we're looking at several years at least of very elevated wholesale electricity prices. That's what the futures market is saying. And I would say for most of this decade, the likelihood that gas prices will be much, much higher than we've previously expected. At some point, that's going to flip. So we've got plenty more crisis to go. And while if you do some really dodgy maths to try and estimate the costs of what we've just gone through, like the period of the electricity market being suspended, you might get to something in the order of $70 or $80 per head in the eastern half of the country. But that for extreme prices for a relatively brief period. But if prices are just more or less where we think they're going to be over the next couple of years, that turns into more like $800 per head per year. So the slow boil crisis is pretty bad. On the other side of that, the things that I think people should keep in mind are we are probably going to see a bit of a sawtooth in electricity prices into the future as while this dynamic of old coal retiring due to low prices, which we will get back to at some point, and a briefly tighter market producing higher prices, then more renewables, then more retirement. We're going to see that dynamic, so expect more volatility. But also what you could do to the shape of your load profile when you are using energy is just as important as how much you're using. And being able to use it in the middle of the day is going to be increasingly to your advantage, both to match the cheaper energy that will be available at that time, but also to help stabilize the whole system. And there may be financial incentives through market reform for that kind of additional financial incentives for that kind of reshaping of your profile.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess last year people started to wonder about the value of longer term PPAs, and I think our message has always been not to get too fixated on whatever the state of the market was now, because there was probably a different one coming along soon.
They look pretty good now.
Yeah, that's right. We'd be pretty happy to be on a PPA now. Obviously, we've been through several ups and downs in just the 5 years that PPAs have been around, but a really good point that load shaping and shifting consumption into the middle of the day, the lower price period is going to reduce your vulnerability and increase the value of any PPAs you do regardless. I think, John, we're going to move now to a couple of questions for Lisa around supply chain issues.
Yeah, certainly. As many of you are aware, there are supply side problems in today's energy market. And in this segment, we're going to look at that issue. Lisa, if I can start with you, right now, what are the biggest knowns and unknowns when it comes to project delivery? And, are there, if you've already contracted a particular project, are there any delivery risks that people need to be aware of?
I'll start with the first around the known unknowns and things that we talk a lot about, but that come to mind, immediately. And the first is around grid connection. So you might have a project that is looking to connect to the grid and might be facing some issues with that. We saw a great deal of that over the last 2 years in this market, which has actually constrained what has actually been able to come and be delivered to the market in terms of electricity supply. And that will continue to be a risk that we need to be aware of. So it's one of those, we know this issue exists. We don't always know how it will unfold. Probably another that comes to mind would be around transmission projects. So there's massive transmission enhancements that need to be made that the ISP just talked a great deal about, that AMO delivered yesterday. Was it the day before? All the days blend together in this market. Those transmission projects are really important to making sure that the renewable supply from the res areas and other projects gets to the grid where it should be, where it needs to be consumed. So that's another that is certainly unknown, because there is risk in when those projects can get delivered and at what cost. And the last one, so you mentioned around supply chain issues. Certainly there's, as AMO's ISP mentions, there's issues around not just physical resources in terms of materials, but also labor resources as well. But maybe let me just talk a little bit about solutions, because I hate to just go, oh, there we have a whole bunch of problems. It would be fantastic if we could really concentrate as a country on what are those labor skills needed for that new economy. What are the manufacturing facilities required so that we aren't as reliant on global supply chains to achieve this new economy, this new energy system that we need to achieve. So that's the first around supply chains and solutions. Around transmission projects, this is potentially somewhat out of our hands, but at least having greater information, so some more transparency, would be very helpful in being able to manage the risk as they arise. So rather than being sort of blindsided by something occurring in a transmission project or in a large, supply project that, as with a recent example, those blindsiding outcomes are a bit difficult for investors and consumers to manage. And grid connections, I think AEMO has made some pretty good commitments in terms of being able to improve that grid connection process. And I think continuing with the transparency around that would be helpful as well, to make sure that people feel comfortable.
Lisa, when a company is deciding to contract, what are some of the current market features that buyers should be thinking about?
Let me back up one step and first say every company that is buying renewables or is on the path to buy renewables should really start with a strategy. Because if you just jump into it and have an intent, you might get to the end of your process and you haven't done the legwork to figure out what am I trying to do, why am I trying to do it, and have I gotten my stakeholders on board. So starting with those three things. Now, okay, we've settled those things. Now moving into what are the things that we might want to look for in today's market. A big one for me is flexibility, because this is a fast-changing market, and these are fast-changing products. And the ability that a company might have to be flexible themselves should also be changing very quickly over the next couple of years. As new technologies are adopted at your facility or at your building, you might be able to do something different. And if you've locked yourself into a very strict, inflexible contract, you'll be giving up the benefit of the effort that you might be making over the next couple of years to do better energy management or to use technology in a different way so that you can be more flexible. So that's probably the first thing that comes to mind is flexibility. Another thing you might want to think about, again, coming back to making sure it's associated with your risk tolerance, or at least appropriate for it, is maybe something like the market following type products that we see, where as the market declines over the next couple of years, your products might come down with it. Obviously, most long-term products have that smoothing nature to them. And the last one very much, again, needs to be associated or okay with your risk tolerance, but potentially spot exposure. And again, this comes back to that ability to take advantage, as Tennant mentioned. If you can consume in the middle of the day, okay, so maybe you can't do that very much right now, but 2 years down the track, you may have done all this work so that you're really responding to the supply when it's available. And if you do that through some type of spot exposure, you want to make sure that you have the ability to do that either now or into the future. So those are a couple of things to think about, aside from all the many very long list of legal issues that you need to think about.
Actually, I'll throw this question to all three of you, Lisa, Jonathan, and Tennant. One of the most common questions we get asked at RE100, and I'm sure the same is the case for BRC-A, is what is the business argument for switching to renewable energy? What's your view on that?
Maybe I'll start, since I still have my mute button on or off. So the business argument is manifold, but I'll start with one and allow others to cover many of the others. So for me, it's very much around that consumer preference and the stakeholder preference. So you have consumers who are going to push you that direction if they haven't already. You also have all of your stakeholders that will be pushing you that direction, whether it's your financing or your insurance. And these are crucial to maintain in any business. So that's probably the first commercial aspect. that comes to mind for me.
Tennant, what's your view?
Well, so I'll mention two things. One is that it does enable you to take some control as part of a portfolio of managing your energy bill, but take some control of what your costs are going to be. You know, there will be times when those contracts will be in the money. Sometimes they'll be out of the money, but you're not just exposed to whatever's going on out there. So that's a financial benefit. The other thing is that depending on which sector and what you make, you may gain a competitive advantage or risk a loss of competitiveness in supplying markets that have got carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Now, today, nobody does. It's looking very, very likely that Europe will have concluded agreement on its carbon border adjustment by the end of this year. That will initially apply to a narrow range of energy and emissions intensive products. It is likely to expand considerably over time. It won't expand to everything, but if you can demonstrate good data for covered products that you've got a high share of renewable energy in the input energy for that product, you're going to face less of an impost at the border into Europe and any other economies that go down the same path. It's looking plausible that the United Kingdom will, Canada, quite possible. Japan, well, we'll see. They've got a bit of a reckoning to do with the whole of their domestic climate policy, but it is becoming something that is competitively relevant in trade.
Jonathan?
Yeah, from my side, I think the business imperative is pretty much as clear as it can become in these times, isn't it? So BRC-A has been supporting corporates to learn about corporate PPAs for 3 or 4 years now. And I think a lot of the messages we provided those corporates about protecting yourself from higher prices, hedging your exposure to the market risk, how that gas is often the price setter and there's a risk of gas prices going up, and that will in turn see electricity prices go up. A lot of those messages are really coming through now. And I think back to the first large-scale off-site solar PPA by Telstra with Emerald Solar Farm in 2017. And you can always get a bit of a hint out of the press releases on what was the business case. And in their case, they identified to cap themselves and protect themselves from future high prices. And with that solar farm, it's a wholesale PPA. So Telstra would be paying a fixed price for that energy and receiving the wholesale revenues. So whilst their electricity bills in Queensland would be going up, they would be getting increased revenues from their wholesale PPA with that solar farm. And that is kind of protecting them from those increased electricity bills in Queensland. But certainly there's a sort of a lot of pain out there at the moment. So anyone on the webinar today, if you're thinking it's just you, it's not. There are many very large, sophisticated corporates and other energy market participants really hurting at the moment. And there's probably some consultants on the webinar too, wondering what on earth do we do? What do we advise our clients? And the truth is there is no easy answer right now. So you're not alone. But what's happening now is refocusing us that electricity is not just a bill that we pay, that we have to proactively manage our exposure to the energy market, and contracting renewables is certainly a key part of that. Whether it's a retail PPA, fixing in your prices with a retailer backed by renewables for 7 or 10 years, or entering into a wholesale PPA directly with a wind or solar farm, where you still got your electricity bills from your retailer, but separately that wind or solar farm can help hedge your exposure to the energy market.
Again, a question to all three of you. We're seeing in the media a lot of reporting about coal-fired power stations being very regularly down for maintenance these days. You know, sometimes 20 to 30% of coal-fired power stations are down, and obviously that's causing problems. given that both BRC-A and RE100 are asking companies to make that switch to going 100% renewable, is there enough renewable energy out there in the pipeline? And with regards to the current grid, we're hearing a lot of issues about renewable energy projects sometimes having problems getting that energy. They're building the solar farms, they're building the wind farms. Are we going to have any problems getting that renewable energy into the grid? And what kind of changes do you think we need to see there?
Shall I keep going? But certainly there's a huge pipeline. AEMO released their latest update. I think it was 150 gigawatts of new generation projects in various stages. That said, there are some limitations. So certainly in New South Wales, we started running out of potential places to connect new large-scale wind and solar. And therefore, the New South Wales government has undertaken renewable energy zone projects. So the first one in Central West Orana, another one in New England led by Transgrid, and more renewable energy zones. And that's probably less of a problem in Queensland and Victoria, but Victoria is also initiating renewable energy zones, and Queensland as well. So there might be some lag to be able to fully develop and deliver projects to respond to the current shortfall. And I'd also like to make the comment that the outages on the coal power stations, I do wonder if this will provide a limitation on their ability to offer baseload futures. So Tennant referred to futures a bit in his excellent comments. And futures is often really what passes through to electricity bills, because retailers buy their energy forward using baseload futures and other products. And so they can offer fixed rates next year or the year after, whether it's residential at home or commercial or industrial. And with those risks of outages, large generators are possibly less able to offer baseload futures to sell them to retailers. So that's reduces supply of those. And whilst the wholesale market might recover in the next 2 to 3 months, that could be a more terminal issue where baseload futures don't come down because of this risk of outages. And therefore, if we're just using the typical buying strategy of buying 1 or 2 or 3 years via baseload futures, which is what corporates often do with 1 to 3 year tenders, it really brings into focus that need to do more to enter into renewable PPAs potentially and support new generation to bring on that new supply to actually moderate those electricity bills.
Lisa.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just add, because one of the parts of the question that you asked was around what do we need to do to make sure we're going to get enough renewables in. So certainly there's a lot in the pipeline. I think what's really needed is a bit of certainty around the policy framework and the investment framework. And I think that's what has created part of where we are now, right? Is that many years of chopping and changing and let's try that on and never mind, we won't do that after everyone has invested time and trying to sort out a specific piece of policy. And that has created an investment environment where there hasn't been enough certainty for investors to feel comfortable. So I think we need a few things set in stone, if you will, to really encourage the investment that's required. So whether it's a very clear, written in stone emissions cap or something along those lines, so that it's clear what needs to be done to achieve that, which would include the investment in renewables.
Tennant.
Look, I will add 2 things, I think. One is that there's a world of difference between achieving 100% or high percent renewables as an accounting exercise for one entity and building a 100% or 90% or very high renewables energy system that everybody shares. And the former, like the accounting exercise, is not meaningless. That is a process that has supported the development of a lot of projects that have made a significant real world difference. But it's just quite different to delivering a whole system that is heavily renewable. And the things that we need to do, I mean, there's a long list, and we should all be poring over the integrated system plan from yesterday. But like, one of the things that is clearly a big deal in that list is transmission. Lots of transmission. And yes, people don't like great big transmission lines near them. Some people think they're pretty ugly. But if we don't have that transmission, then we are stuck like with the decaying husk of the coal-fired power stations that we are not ready to do without, but they're just about ready to do without us. So we really need to get going on that. And there's a massive financial stake, actually, that even communities next door to these proposed mega transmission lines, they have a financial stake in them going ahead too, because their electricity bills are going to double and stay doubled if nothing is done.
Now, before I pass across to Chris for the final section on current opportunities, just to remind everyone who's watching, if you do have any questions you'd like to ask of the panel, please put your questions in the chat in the Zoom app. I can see we've already got a few questions that we're going to read out after we've gone through current opportunities. So I'll pass back to Chris now for the next section.
Thanks, John. And in fact, I'm going to pick up on one of the questions, because it actually leads into the sort of things we were going to discuss with Jonathan. One question is, we've seen a shift in recent years towards retail sleeve PPAs for customers looking to decarbonise their supply and paying extra LGCs. Do you see a shift back towards wholesale PPAs as opportunities to hedge against higher prices? So yeah, I guess we're interested in you unpacking a little bit about some of the different deal types and the risks associated, the pros and cons in the current market.
Indeed, it could almost be a Dorothy Dixer for me, isn't it? It's a topic we've been discussing quite a bit lately. So retail PPAs, wholesale PPAs, and sleeved PPAs. So I'll start with retail PPAs, because they're probably what most people think of and have been very common in the last couple of years. That's where you sign up with a retailer, and you generally for 7 to 10 years, and you get firm peak, shoulder, and off-peak prices for that period. And we've seen lots of deals like this, whether it's Snowy with Dexus or Iberdrola have signed some deals like this recently. Zen Energy as well, Origin, and pretty much all of the retailers. And the beauty of this is they're fairly, they're less complex. You don't have to explain to your stakeholders internally what a contract for difference is. It's just peak, shoulder, and off peak. We're going longer. And also that retailer manages all the development risk and PPA risk with the wind and solar farms, and they might draw from a portfolio or a single project. Wholesale PPAs are more complex, typically used by the larger buyers, and were very common 3 to 4 years ago. And there is settled on the wholesale market and separate from your electricity retail agreement, which you still have to do anyway every 2 to 3 years, or however you buy your electricity. And then finally is sleeved, where you pick the best project, you pick the best retailer, and you have a long-term contract with the wind or solar farm, and get a retailer to turn that into peak, shoulder, and off peak. That might be for 3 years or longer with that retailer. And we did see large buyers who have even done wholesale PPAs move to preferring sleeve retail PPAs or retail PPAs, because the market has matured and you can get all the same benefits and less complexity. Now wholesale markets are high, and that baseload futures are high, making the retail offering more challenging. We may see a switch back to wholesale PPAs as they become more popular. The challenge is that those projects take 1 to 3 years to develop after signing the PPA to get finance constructed and connected and generating. So the wholesale market might not be as high by the time it starts generating, and certainly not for the following 10 years or whatever it may be afterwards.
Great, thank you. I might take another question, because from the audience, I think it flows on actually somewhat, and others might have views on this as well. Peter Vaughan asks, should buyers go to markets for retail renewable energy agreements consider the capacity of different retailers to survive wholesale volatility? If so, are there specific contracting strategies that buyers should be considering?
Yes, it's certainly been highlighted recently that there is always that risk to consider, that the retailer may not survive unprecedented circumstances like today. And that comes from a few ways. Have they properly forward bought their energy, so they are covered if prices go up when they're providing you that fixed price? And also prudential requirements. So retailers exposed to the market are often required to make a down payment effectively to AMO. And when the wholesale price goes up, their exposure goes up. So AMO might ask them to increase that. And that can put a restriction on their funding or cash flow. So certainly one to be cognizant of when evaluating retail PPA tenders is the creditworthiness of that retailer, their ability to survive or continue operating through more challenging market conditions like at the moment, and also fallback positions. What happens in your contract if the retailer does go insolvent? Can you still get your renewable energy? Can you switch to another other retailer, etc.?
I might take the liberty of asking a follow-on question from that, which is there a risk of reduced competition and having an impact on the supply and the corporate PPA market, because some of the smaller retailers that are more vulnerable have been sometimes the more active ones in the corporate PPA market? Any thoughts on that across?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first, and Lisa might have a comment on this, but and it's more opinion, this piece of this question. But I think, Chris, it's something that you and I have enjoyed, hasn't it? So being in this corporate PPA space for 4 years with Business Renewable Centre, watching the initial models and watching retailers come in with new offerings and all the innovation that's taking place. And that's a combination of larger retailers and gentailers and smaller startups that have come in and established an excellent model and business in this space. So this can certainly make it more challenging for the smaller ones who don't have the larger balance sheet to continue offering those innovative products in this context. Yeah, Lisa, did you have any thoughts on top of that too?
Yeah, I will say, and again, this is more opinion. It is a shame to see some of the more innovative, smaller retailers struggling, because it is those companies that have been driving forward the market. They've been driving forward the products on offer. And as a result of the difficulty that's being faced now, we might lose some of the innovation that that consumers have been able to benefit from, rather than being beholden to a very small number of very large companies who are maybe less interested in providing new products to consumers to help, share the benefit. So I think something that we need to think about as we think about the market design is, how can we better support smaller innovative companies to ensure that we don't end up in a situation where there is not enough competition and where we are actually being held back by a small number of very large companies who might be less flexible, a bit more like turning a battleship than turning a little dinghy. So I think it's something that we need to be very aware of and try to support those smaller companies somehow going forward.
I'll just add one extra thing, which is that being an integrated generator retailer looks pretty good right now. Not having a physical asset that provides you with some protection as a retailer against movements in the wholesale market looks very risky right now. And so, like, thinking about what physical assets does your retailer have? Not just do they have any, but like what are the characteristics of those assets? Because if they own gas generation, can they get the gas, and are they paying enormous prices? If so, if they own coal, are they likely to flood or break down? If they are a renewables heavy one, what's their firming or the rest of their strategy, and what does that limit what they're willing to offer you in terms of coverage for how much of your energy needs? So I think it boils down to if the contract really matters, like it's for a large proportion of your needs, then you're going to want to do even more due diligence than we used to think you want to do.
You've sparked a couple of thoughts in my mind. Something we've often helped with our corporates with educating their organisations on PPAs is when someone internally says this looks really risky, we have to remind them that doing nothing is also extremely risky, like we're seeing right now. And similarly with those retailers, that none of those options are risk-free, aren't they? So we hear of the gas price going up, so that's hurting the gas generators. We hear of Energy Australia writing down $1 billion of losses because their coal units were out during high prices and they'd pre-sold that in baseload futures. And my mind went to Snowy and how they're sitting pretty, but currently they've got limitations on how much hydro they can generate because downstream there's still so much water around that their environmental flows are limited. So it's tricky to navigate, and there is nothing that is risk-free in the market right now.
I'll pull out one more question and then pass back to John afterwards. There's a question for you, Lisa, which was that you noted we should look for flexibility in a PPA. Could you give some examples of what that flexibility might be? Also, isn't it a seller's market? How much leverage does the buyer have when seeking flexibility?
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. So some of the things that come to mind when I think about flexibility are relating back to what your load might look like. For example, you might want the ability to have the retailer reprice your load, assuming this is retail PPA, reprice your load in the future based on your new load shape. Because the firming cost might be different today than what you will expect it to be after you've done a bunch of energy efficiency projects and maybe you've added on-site stuff and you've added batteries and you've put in building management systems or what have you. So your load shape might have a different risk profile to it, a different firming cost, and being able to reprice that at times in the future, I think is a good piece to think about in terms of a retail PPA. A seller's market, perhaps a bit at the moment, but one of the ways that you can work around that is to join a buying group. One of the things that we like to do at Schneider Electric is to help with Scope 3. So for example, we even have our own Scope 3 program, which is called Zero Carbon Project, where we're working with our top 1,000 suppliers globally to help them decarbonize 50% by 2025. And one of the major ways to do that is to group folks together and help them buy renewables. We're doing something similar with Walmart with their project Gigaton. So that's a way that you can create some buying power regardless of what the market looks like today. And while we might have a bit of an imbalance at the moment, I think as some of the projects that are in the pipeline are trying to get up, there's going to be a lot of availability and need for corporate PPAs to be signed to underwrite those new projects to get those final investment decisions.
I think also that speaks to the flexibility within the contract and sort of that operations phase of the PPA. I think it's important to consider the flexibility in the process of contracting. So often that can be sort of a 3 to 6 month business case phase, then a 6 to 9 month procurement phase. And as we've seen, the market is pretty much upside down compared to 12 months ago. What was true 12 months ago is not true today. So it'd be interesting to hear from you again, Lisa. If you're a sustainability manager or project manager managing the procurement process of a renewable PPA, for example, and that's a 6 to 18 month process, I guess you have to instill flexibility even in that, don't you? That if you say very early on, this is going to be our contract model and it's going to look like this, and it takes another 6 to 12 months to get to tenders and a preferred tender, then you have to have flexibility that actually an alternate model might be better by that time. So maybe that's in doing that internal stakeholder engagement and management during the process of procurement, would be more to stick to principles and objectives rather than being too matter of fact on we're going down this route, not that route, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes back to, again, that first must do, that due diligence around setting your strategy, engaging with your stakeholders and educating them, getting them on board, understanding your risk profile so that you're making those decisions based on principles rather than a specific, this is exactly the route that we're going to take, because as you mentioned, things might change, not only within your own organization, but within the market. But having a good understanding and principle of what it is you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it, and how you might be able to do that will give you those guardrails, if you will, so that you can continue to evaluate several different things as your procurement process evolves, and ensure that each of the ones that you are still considering still meets those objectives that you laid out at the beginning. And as long as you are achieving that, then your stakeholders will be happy with, regardless of what you get to at the end of the process. So rather than telling your stakeholders, we are going to do exactly this thing and it's going to look exactly this way, you go, this is what we're looking to achieve. And we get to the end, you go, hey, we told you we were going to achieve this, and here's how this particular thing that we decided on does that.
Well, let's go to the audience Q&A. This is the part of the webinar where we're going to pass the floor over to you, our audience. So if you haven't yet put a question in, please feel free to do so in the chat section of the Zoom app. We've got one question here. It said, in considering participation in a group renewable electricity PPA, such as an MREP, what is the ideal minimum demand of individual organizations? Noting it is acknowledged that combined demand would need to be over 25 gigawatt hours a year. Who wants to take that one on?
I think we've seen a lot of these at BRC-A, and they're a great example where, just say a customer is around, a buyer is around 20 gigawatt hours. That's the equivalent of around a 10 megawatt solar farm. And so alone, that there's not enough demand to unlock project finance of a new large-scale wind or solar project. However, if they team up with another 4 or 5 of similar organisations of similar scale, they kind of get over that hurdle and they can go to market and get really competitive offers from multiple projects or retailers. So that's the beauty of those group deals. I think typically based on MREP2, led by City of Melbourne and ISPT, they sought to get to about 100 gigawatt hours. So that's equivalent of like a 50 megawatt solar farm or 30 megawatts of wind. Once those group deals have reached that amount, they can potentially open up to smaller buyers where, all right, we've got 100 gigawatt hours, they're committed. We've got a couple of 10s, a couple of 30s, there's a bit of variance. They can open it up to the smaller buyers, but they really need that strong anchor to underpin the overall deal. A key comment on the group deals, though, is one thing City of Melbourne learned from MREP1 is that they're best done where the companies are very aligned. They're trying to achieve similar things. If it's like a kid's party and that one's allergic to peanuts and that one's allergic to sugar or something, it can be hard to strike a deal if everyone has those different goals.
Just to follow
Any
up,
other feedback?
the individual question was actually also about the individual minimum organisation demands. So how small is too small to be part of a group deal, do you think? Yeah,
so I think once the anchor is set, they can be smaller, but probably 10, but maybe it could go down to 5 gigawatt hours per annum if there's enough anchors in there. And every group deal is a little bit different as well. So yeah, there's some guidance, 5 to 10, I would say.
And I'd add that the smaller companies can be thinking about how can they work with their stakeholders, whether it's their employees or folks in their supply chains, to try to get a bigger load to negotiate with to join a group, or even to create a group of their own. So something else to be thinking about as we move forward is how can we be even more creative in how we're actually going to achieve this renewable future.
Tennant, any thoughts?
No, I have no better wisdom than what's already been said.
And now one of the questions that's come in on the chat, someone has asked, can you suggest an appropriate length for a PPA?
And Swara, I've had that question as well. So what strategy for energy retailers to adopt withstanding this crisis? So The longest I've seen is University in California did 25 years. I think a lot of the early PPAs were 15 years and then moderating down to 10 to 12. And then a lot of corporate PPAs the last couple of years have been more 7 to 8 years. I think it really is 10 to 12 that unlocks project finance and reduces that cost of capital. But I do realise that is a bit tough for some corporate stakeholders to take a punt on something in 10 and 12 years' time. So in maturity of the market, that's often come down to 7 to 8 years.
Now, one question for all three of you. There are still people out there who are only just starting to get to grips with this. And obviously there's a lot of pressure from senior management now looking at electricity bills, looking at supply issues. For someone, for a company that's maybe just starting out, looking at this whole issue, what advice would you give to companies that are considering going down the renewable energy PPA side of things? What would be the key advice that each of you would give?
I might start off and say, look, the very first thing to do is to actually better understand your own energy use and needs, to do either have somebody in-house who is an energy specialist. That's not going to be efficient for every business, but if not, to get some external analysis and advice, because you may have a lot of opportunities to just use less energy. You may have opportunities to produce energy on site. Then for whatever you definitely need from the market, then you are in a good position to look at not just how much, but the shape of the profile and what that means for the costs of firming any contract that you'll have. So know thyself is the starting place.
Maybe I'll pick up from where Tennant dropped off. So I completely agree with what Tennant has said. That's a massive requirement to be able to make the right decisions. Something that we think about at Schneider Electric is thinking holistically. So don't just look at how am I going to buy renewables in isolation in this little silo, but speaking back to what Tennant has said, how can you reduce what you're consuming? How can you ensure that what you're going to do in all these different pieces is going to hit your sustainability goals? What does that mean for your marketing, et cetera, et cetera? So if you think about all of your energy portfolio as a holistic portfolio, you will have far better outcomes than if you have, the sustainability team driving the procurement manager to buy renewables and the engineering team over here is doing something completely different. Nobody's talking to each other. So making sure that you're thinking holistically and setting a holistic strategy is something that we like to talk a lot about because there's benefits to be had.
And
Tennant.
I think it was great that Tennant went first and Lisa provided such an objective response, but we would certainly say join Business Renewable Centre and attend a boot camp. And is it fair to say that pretty much all solutions right now are clean energy solutions to both fix the energy market, the energy system, and our own exposure to energy markets? So yes, concur with Tennant and Lisa. And it's encouraging that almost all the solutions right now will result in more energy efficiency and more renewable generation and more storage.
Jonathan, for people who do want to get that information from BRC-A, what information is on the website and what is the website address?
Yeah, so I'll post the website address in the chat, is probably the easiest, or maybe Alex or Chris could do that. I'll answer the question. And we've been going through a bit of a transitional phase, as Chris mentioned, that are starting to ramp up, like this event, our memberships and developing boot camps for in the coming months. So get in touch via our website and we'll keep you up to date when the next boot camp is.
We got a question from Paul Howdle. He said regulators here in the UK and the European Union are looking to evolve the current LGC model to a 24/7 matching model where renewable energy claims can only be made if consumption can be traced and matched to clean energy generation in the same hour of the same day. How should this influence PPA thinking? Has anyone got a view on that?
Maybe I'll start. So this actually relates back to what Tennant had said earlier, in fact, about a single company being renewable can be viewed a bit as an accounting exercise, right? You buy LGCs and it covers the whole year, and it's not about optimizing the type of projects that you are engaging with, unless you have spot price exposure. And we have plenty of case studies around how we've done that to analyze what's the profile of the generation, what's the profile of the load, what's the right match, therefore what's the cost of the firming, etc. But really, companies need to be thinking about that future of, yes, we need to be more than just on an accounting year renewable. We need to be 24/7 renewable. We need to consume when renewables are plentiful, store it, and then use the storage when renewables are not plentiful. And being able to demonstrate that you actually are 24/7 renewable, or getting close to that, is something very important. Again, thinking back to that flexibility of how are you going to change your load profile, how will your PPA adjust for that if it's a retail PPA. It's a lot easier if it's a virtual or a wholesale PPA. But this is an important thing that will change as the market evolves.
Certainly.
And I'll just add one follow-up thought there, which is I mentioned carbon border adjustment mechanisms earlier. It is sooner or later, the European one is going to include Scope 2 emissions accounting for electricity use, and it might be in from the start. We'll see how that gets finalised. And if so, the kind of paper trail and awareness that you would develop as part of a 24/7 clean power standard would be extremely useful for demonstrating or evidencing what your liability should or shouldn't be at the border for covered exports to jurisdictions like Europe that are going to have a CBAM.
I'll just be quick because we're running out of time, but certainly generating renewable energy is only half of the equation. We also have to consume it. So moderating when we use energy to when solar and wind is abundant is a key part of the transition.
Chris, before I wrap up, any final word from you?
No, I think that's it. Probably just to let people know that we'll have a webinar next month as well. And I think we're going to do something on LGC market trends, which is another keen issue. So hopefully we'll see you all then as well.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time with today's webinar. So on behalf of the BRC-A, the Climate Group, CDP and Do Something, thanks for joining us for today's webinar. We hope you got a lot out of it. If you do want more information on RE100, please visit our website at re100.org. I'm John D from RE100 and the Do Something Foundation. Thanks for joining us. And again, thanks to Jackie for helping to organise this. And thanks to the BRC-A for doing this with us. They're a great organisation. The web address for BRC-A is in the chat there. If you do want more information, they've got some great educational materials. So please do use them. Thanks for joining us and bye for now. And thanks to the panelists.